All right, for today's lesson, we're covering pages 119 to 129. More importantly, we're covering the concept of empires and civilizations in collision, the Persians and the Greeks. And in order to do that, there are four subheadings to this section: the Persian Empire, the Greeks, collision, the Greco-Persian Wars, and collision, Alexander and the Hellenistic era. So we'll go over those four topics, kind of just guiding along with the reading. Remember that this is a supplement, not a replacement to the reading, and it just guides you along. So the first thing we want to talk about is the Persian Empire. And one of the questions that we want to remember while we're doing this is, how did the Persian and Greek civilizations differ in their political organization and values? So just think, how did the Persians and the Greeks differ? That's one thing that is often talked about when you talk about the Greco-Persian Wars and interaction, is how did these people differ? So think about the Persians, and later as we learn about the Greeks, how did they differ? We'll talk about the Persian Empire. Most impressive of the ancient world, around 500 BCE. I mean, this guy was big. Probably one of the biggest ones we've seen up until that point. As the book mentions, it follows along the lines of the empires that it will conquer. So, for example, the Mesopotamian empires, the Egyptian empires, it will conquer those, assimilate those. It's very good at learning what other empires do well, taking them and expanding, and it just does it at a larger area, in a bigger sense than the empires before it. The founder of the empire is a guy named Cyrus the Great. Cyrus, you want to know, especially because of his tolerance. He's famous not only for his conquests, and he, along with not his son, but a successor named Darius, or Darius, depending on how you pronounce it, do a lot of conquest. They are able to take over quite a bit of land, but he's famous mostly for his tolerance. He's famous in the Bible for freeing the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. And it mentions that he sets the precedent of a benevolent nature towards minorities within the empire. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not still an empire. There still will be rebellions because they were conquered peoples. I mean, the Persians did conquer all of these other lands, and there will be rebellions periodically that he and his successors will try, and in many cases be successful in putting down, but there will be rebellions. It's also important to note that these are absolute monarchs. These are known as the kings of kings, or king of kings, Shah na Shah. Meaning, it's a huge empire. He's taking over multiple kingdoms. He's already a king, or they're already a king, and in taking over multiple kingdoms, he's now a king of so many kings, he's the king of kings. That's a long way to say, but he is the king of kings. It's a title he takes. They are absolute monarchs. There's a whole elaborate system of how to even talk to them. And they're Zoroastrian, meaning they follow the god Ahura Mazda and the teachings of Zoroaster or Zarathustra. Now, how religious Cyrus was is somewhat up for debate. His predecessors and later Persian dynasties will become vehemently Zoroastrian, which we won't talk about too much right now. But it's good to just know that Zoroastrianism and Ahura Mazda are part of this empire as well, or at least from the ruling class. Combine that with the tolerance that Cyrus sets as a precedent. Another thing that you should learn from this section of reading is the effectiveness of the Persian administration. So the first thing is they've split up the empire into many what we call satraps or satraps. There were roads, including the famous Royal Road, which follows along here, standardized coinage, good roads throughout the empires, bridges, irrigation system. There's just a lot of infrastructure. There's order. It's set into motion. And this is what allows Cyrus the Great and his successors, compared to other empires we've seen of conquest, where they just take over, to last for such a long time. And not only that, but the precedent of a Persian dynasty, a Persian empire setting the stage, will be very hard to put away. And in fact, we will see Persian empires into the modern era. The next group we have to talk about are the Greeks. The Greeks were said to have gone around the Aegean Sea like a frog around a pond, or like frogs around a pond. A couple of things that we should notice from this particular reading is that they are contrasted with the Persians not just because they will later come into conflict with each other, but because they're also so different politically. Whereas Persia is this large, monolithic kingdom, the Greeks were split up politically into a bunch of small city-states, sharing a common language, a common culture, a common love for warfare, but never a common political unit at this stage. That being said, the Greeks did expand. They did colonize. They might not have gone into a lot of conquest, but they did do colonization, finding new places in which to live and to grow, trading and interacting with local peoples. The Greeks are probably most famous for the role of citizenship. Citizenship is where ordinary males within the society will make the decisions for the society. The most famous of these is Athens. Athens is where democracy is born, where all free male citizens could vote and decide policy for that city-state. Athens was not the rule, it was the exception. Citizenship wasn't even the rule for all of Greece. It was in many city-states, but it was not universal. And democratic Athens sometimes got a bad reputation. A lot of philosophers thought that it was volatile and dangerous. And yet, we in the Enlightenment era, in America and in the West, consider this to be a huge advancement because of the concept of democracy, because of self-governance, and because of participation of citizens. At that point, it was only males, adult free males, and citizenship will expand, and it goes from city-state to city-state. But the concept of self-governance and citizenship is here in Greece, and is probably what they're most famous for. So, whether it is accurate or not, one of the traditional narratives about this has been the contrast between the free Greeks and the tyrannical Persians. That argument does not stand up to a lot of scrutiny, and despite not being able to stand up to that scrutiny, it is still a pervasive argument and a pervasive narrative. The next thing we're going to talk about is how these two civilizations clash, and we move on to Greco-Persian wars. These wars are famous for a lot of reasons. The first being a mismatch. The gigantic Persian Empire coming in, and this is only a small part of it, coming in against the very small Greek city-states. So we have the large Persian Empire coming in on the smaller Greek city-states. And the Greeks, through a combination of luck, strategy, tactics, and technology, are able to beat the Persians in two wars, some battles of which are very famous, like Thermopylae, Salamis, Marathon, right? These battles will be very famous in the Greco-Persian Wars. But in world history, what happens after the war is probably what's more important. The Persians will go back and worry about their own affairs. The Greeks, on the other hand, especially Athens, will change. Long story short, Athens gets a little big for its britches, starts to expand, creates this large empire under the guise of creating a league in case the Persians attack again. The Spartans resent the fact that the Athenians are doing this, create their own league, and the two go to war. It's a very bloody, long civil war. And subsequent wars and warfare between large city-states will ensue in Greece. Until the next thing happens. Alexander. Well, not necessarily Alexander, but Alexander's father, Philip. Philip of Macedon will come down, conquer and unified the Greek states. And this is where we go to our next section. The next section is Alexander and the ushering in of the Hellenistic era. Alexander was a dynamic individual, a fearless leader, power-hungry. We won't talk a lot about that. Suffice it to say he leads his army in order to gain vengeance against the Persians for their attack on Greece. In his 20s, he will lead a 10-year campaign throughout the Persian Empire against Darius III, who is now the king of Persia, beating him at every turn, and eventually conquering the entire empire. He will go into India, having conquered the Persians, but will die at a young age, in his 30s, without returning to Greece, and leaving no real successor. His generals will then divide up his empire. The Greeks called themselves the Hellenes, so we call this the Hellenistic kingdoms. And this is truly the time when Greek culture will spread. This is the Hellenistic period. And through a series of conquests, which we saw under Alexander the Great, and then through the upper class of Greeks in all of these main cities, because remember the Greeks loved cities and city-states, we see a sort of blending of cultures, intertrading, as well as an interconnectivity that we hadn't really seen from the Greeks beforehand. It is important to note that as this trading and as this interconnectivity is happening, it will eventually fade. As the Hellenistic kingdoms weaken and fall, so will the Hellenistic culture.